Yeah, first I have a couple of questions for the administration. At the last meeting, I asked the number of miles that would be covered by the miles of street that would be covered by the revised ordinance. Mr. Vecchio used the figure 75. Is that an accurate number according to you? And secondly, I asked for a map of what streets would be involved. You have that map?
Mr. President, I have some figures that were provided by the Public Works Department that it is just approximately 75 miles of streets in the city of Cranston that are wider than 30 feet. They did not have figures for the other criteria of 25 miles per hour or greater, but it's a safe estimation that it would be very close to that same number. Wider streets tend to have higher speed limits. It's the narrower streets where the speed limit has to be reduced. They did not have a map available, so I unfortunately don't have that for the council.
Okay, so there's no map, and there's an estimate of approximately 75 miles. That's a little bit fuzzy. The first thing the members of the council know this, but I'd like to let the public know a little bit how this issue has developed. This proposal on panhandling was first introduced last fall, and it was sponsored by everyone who was then on the council. And we then heard from our attorney at the time. We had 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and everyone was on sponsored it. And we then heard from Mr. Quinlan, and we heard arguments against it. And the 5 Democrats on the council came to the conclusion that it was an unconstitutional ordinance. So we voted it down. And we had an election. And in the election, we went from 5 Democrats and 4 Republicans to 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And then the ordinance was resubmitted. And that's where we are. That's where we are today. There's been, I really find it hard to believe that, although I agree with a lot of the comments about the distastefulness of seeing panhandlers, I find it very hard to believe that anyone who has read this Portland case could come to the conclusion that Cranston is going to win this case. And I'd like to read some of the material, some of the excerpts from that case. The first thing that they said is, we conclude that this ordinance is not constitutional because it indiscriminately bans all expressive activity in all the city's median strips, and thus is not narrowly tailored to serve the city's interest in protecting public safety. So the Portland ordinance was restricted to medians. And what we're now voting on is 75 miles approximately of streets. So we're voting on a larger area than the court ruled on in Portland. And here's some of the things that the court went on to say. The district court, that was the court that first heard the case before it went to the Court of Appeals, the district court went on to ask whether the ordinance used the least speech restrictive means to serve a compelling government interest, and that interest being public safety. The crucial question, another quote, the crucial question was whether the ordinance survives narrow tailoring, this concept of narrow tailoring. Now, restrictions on speech have to be content neutral. So you can't say, oh, it's okay to campaign for political candidates, but you can't panhandle. That would not be content neutral. But another quote is, a content neutral restriction. You can just assume that this proposal is content neutral, although there's some questions about that. But a content neutral restriction on speech in a traditional public forum is facially unconstitutional if it does not survive the narrow tailoring inquiry, even though the ordinance might seem to have a number of legitimate applications. It is also hard to imagine a median strip ordinance that could encompass more spaces within its definition than the Portland case. The ordinance restricts speech in all median strips in the entire city of Portland. And we have to remember that the courts have ruled that soliciting is speech. There's another quote. What is more, the ordinance's broad definition of the term median strip does not purport to consider other important factors, such as pedestrian and vehicle traffic patterns on the surrounding sidewalks and roadways. And so it is expansive in that way also. To be sure, plaintiffs, that's the panhandlers, plaintiffs may be able to engage in their speech in places other than medians, such as parks and sidewalks. But the fact that there are other places where plaintiffs may engage in their expressive activity misses the point. A flat ban on speech in a particular forum, like the median ordinance at issue here, can fail narrow tailoring even if it leaves open other channels for plaintiffs to engage in their expressive activity. The record shows that the danger the city identified applies to only a limited number of median strips. Absent evidence about whether the city's other median strips present the same or a similar danger, we have no basis for concluding that a substantial number of them do. The ordinance is thus geographically over-inclusive. To meet the requirement of narrow tailoring, the government must demonstrate that alternative measures that burden substantially less speech would fail to achieve the government's interest. The question here is what alternatives, and Portland was criticized for not looking at alternatives. And here's what the court says on alternatives. The city might also have considered an ordinance that focused more directly on the dangerous activities that were the source of initial concern, such as ordinances directed at public intoxication or belligerent behavior. Or it might have considered limiting activity on medians only at night, when the dark makes it more difficult for drivers to see, or during hazardous weather conditions, when slick roads increase the chances that a car will skid into a median. Nor did the city show that it contemplated and rejected as ineffective an ordinance limited to the few medians in Portland where the city had identified safety hazards in the past, an ordinance limited to the smallest or most dangerous medians. And now the conclusion. In short, the city has not shown that it seriously undertook to address the problem with less obtrusive tools readily available to it. Instead, it sacrificed speech for efficiency, and in doing so, failed to observe the close fit between ends and means that narrow tailoring demands. The city may have been motivated by a perfectly understandable desire to protect the public from the dangers posed by people lingering in median strips. But the city chose too sweeping a means of doing so, given the First Amendment interest in protecting the public's right to freedom of speech. And therefore, the ordinance is unconstitutional. So what we have, I think, is an ordinance that is way too broad. And I think Mark Curtis made the point that there are dangerous intersections and they ought to be identified. But we can't go without any evidence, and we can't go for 75 miles of roadway. It's a loser, and it's going to be a costly loser. And people who vote for it tonight, they're going to feel great, man. They really solved the panhandling problem. And then in 2 years from now, when the Court of Appeals, the very same Court of Appeals that I just read from, not somebody in Missouri or anywhere else, this is the Court of Appeals that's going to hear the Cranston case. And they're going to say just what they said in this ruling. That's why they write decisions, to give people like us some guidance. So they can say, look guys, here's what you can do, and here's what you can't do. And what we might be able to do is a restrictive ordinance where we have evidence on certain intersections, something about whether it's dark, whether it's snowing, but to say 75 miles of roadway is just not going to pass muster. It's just not going to pass. So I oppose this ordinance, his proposal. This is really the main reason I oppose it. And I'd also like to say that just in case anybody thinks that this type of issue is only in Chapel View and Garden City. In Edgewood, we have a free speech problem. If you drive up Broad Street, many days of the week, you will see pictures, alleged pictures of fetuses.
Yeah.
And a lot of us find that very obnoxious and very upsetting. And they're there week after week, and you have to explain what's going on to your kids. They're right outside Betsy Williams Drive, and those people are protected by the same First Amendment that panhandlers are. And we all have to recognize that speech that we don't like is protected by the First Amendment. And that's one of the most wonderful things about this country.